All right, so we're still in God's overall plan of redemption. We're in the United Kingdom right now, and we were talking about David last week. And believe it or not, I intended to finish all of the United Kingdom last Sunday and then get into the divided kingdom this morning. So hopefully we'll do about half and half, but we'll just see how it goes. There's stuff that's so good, I get excited and want to stick on to it. So look with me at 2 Samuel 7. That's where we ended last week. We're talking about David and how David wanted to build a house for God. And God kind of responds and says, did I ever ask for this to happen? But he says, instead of you building a house for me, I'm going to build a house for you. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we'll read verses 12 through 16 again here. Verses 12 through 16, 2 Samuel 7. And God tells David through Nathan the prophet, verse 12, he says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him. He will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. And so last week we started breaking it down sort of phrase by phrase and talking about how, yes, some of these things were partially fulfilled in Solomon, but ultimately they were completely fulfilled in Jesus. And the inverse of that is also true, as we talked about last week. There are some things that only apply to Solomon and don't apply to Jesus later on. And so as we were breaking it down phrase by phrase, we talked about how it says David would lie down with his fathers. It wouldn't happen until after David's death, where it says, I'll raise up your seed after you, and he will come forth from you. It would be someone from David's physical lineage. I will establish his kingdom. The promise of the kingdom of the seed of David would be established. He will build a house for my name. We talked about how the temple was the first fulfillment of that under Solomon, but then we talked about how the house is the church, and we went to several passages at the end of class last week to talk about that. And so then we just briefly mentioned that phrase where it says, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I mean, there's no way that that could be fulfilled by Solomon, because if it was, I mean, he'd still be reigning right now. But that has very much to do with Jesus. And I think that's the one that we closed on. And one of the things I want to point out, where I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, that throne is called the Father's throne. It's called the throne of David. It's called the throne of God, the throne of Israel, and the throne of the kingdom of the Lord. The throne of Israel, I think I already mentioned that. But Solomon's reign wasn't forever. And we see those descriptors mentioned in the New Testament about Jesus. That's fascinating to me. The last phrase I want to notice in this passage here, it's such an important passage, is I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me. This is said about Solomon. If you want to look over at 1 Chronicles 28, 1 Chronicles 28, I just want to notice this one because we've been talking about the dual fulfillment. So Solomon and Jesus with some of these. And in 1 Chronicles 28, if you look down at verse 6, let's see, 1 Chronicles 28, verse 6, God specifically says this about Solomon. And so here in this passage, it says, he said to me, your son Solomon is the one who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. So it's the same sort of account that's being told here, but here it's specifically talking about Solomon. But then further, as we look down later on in Hebrews 1, verse 5, you think about Hebrews 1, the prophets in many ways and many forms spoke to us long ago, but now he has spoken to speak to us through, I think I heard somebody whisper it. What does he say in verse? Yeah, through his son. Yeah, absolutely. And so Jesus is absolutely identified as the Son of God. You think about Luke chapter 1, when Gabriel's talking to Mary, he will be called the Son of God. And we see it over and over and over again in the New Testament. So one of the things I love about this one, I think this might be one of the most palatable, one of the easiest ones to show somebody who might not understand that just because it is a prophecy in the Old Testament, that doesn't mean that there's not an immediate fulfillment, and that there's one way later on that maybe even these people didn't know about. And I think that's a great one to go to for that. And Lord willing, we're going to talk more about the lineage of David as we finish the divided kingdom and hopefully get to the New Testament in just a couple short weeks, because there's some really important connections we need to make. And spoiler alert, when you look at Luke's account and you look at Matthew's account of the lineage of Jesus, they're different. So we'll talk about that, Lord willing, a little bit later on. Any last comments or anything on David? Okay, great. So let's talk about Solomon. Solomon reigned for 40 years. It's fascinating to me. United Kingdom, Saul reigns for 40 years, David reigns for 40 years, and Solomon reigns for 40 years. Did I just say Solomon twice? I meant to say Saul, David, Solomon. Maybe I said Solomon, David, whatever one I just said. Saul, David, Solomon. Each one of them ruled for 40 years. 1 Kings chapter 1 through 11 really covers Solomon's reign. And Solomon's reign started out great. If you go over to 1 Kings chapter 3, 1 Kings chapter 3, and we'll look at verse 3. 1 Kings 3, verse 3. I mean, this is one of those, the first half anyway, is something that I think a lot of us want to be said about us. 1 Kings 3, and look at verse 3, please. And it reads like this: Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high place. So, I mean, right there, the first half of that sounds really, really good. But immediately we are kind of shown the hand, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places there. God asked Solomon what he wanted to give him. This is one of those Sunday school Bible class things we teach to our kids. God asked him, what do you want me to give to you? And Solomon asked for wisdom. How can I guide these people? I'm but a youth. God is pleased with that, gives him riches and honor and wisdom. And so much so that in verse 13, look at verse 13. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you in all of your days. What is a fascinating thing to look at is look at just the amount of wealth that would come in every year, things that came in all at one time from people all around. The numbers are staggering. I remember this was in 2016. I did this thing where I added up all the things and did it using the current valuation, and it was something like, I'm going to butcher this, but it was something like $3 trillion. I was like, that's unreal how much money this guy was bringing in. And that's because he asked for something good here at the beginning here. But by far, the greatest accomplishment of Solomon's reign is building the temple. It took 7 years, and specifically, there are about 184,000 workers that are mentioned. 184,000 workers to build this temple. What's interesting to me, if you look at 1 Chronicles 28, 1 Chronicles 28, please. And 1 Chronicles 28, we'll look down at verse 19. 1 Chronicles 28, we'll look at verse 19. And what's fascinating to me is the design and the blueprint for the temple, David says, was given to him by God. That's just something that's really interesting to me. And here, 1 Chronicles 28, look at verse 19. All this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the details of this pattern, talking about the temple and how it was going to be constructed. So the blueprint and the pattern was given to David by God. And then we could also read about how David also gathered pretty much, not all of the materials, but most of the materials. David actually gathers those before his death. Fascinating stuff. And so 1 Kings chapter 8 is an amazing account of the ark being brought into the temple once it's completed. And the glory of the Lord is so amazing as it fills this temple that the priests can't even go in and perform the work that they're supposed to. The glory of the Lord is just so amazing. And Solomon gives this really powerful address to the people and a prayer to dedicate the temple. So if you're in 1 Kings 8, look at verses 12 and 13 to start, and then I just want to notice a few of these. So 1 Kings 8, verses 12 and 13, Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in the thick cloud. I have surely built you a lofty house, a place for your dwelling forever. So it seems like God is going to dwell there and live. However, I just want to notice a few verses. We did this probably a year ago at this point, but I just want to notice a few of these phrases that are mentioned in this dedicatory prayer for the temple and how Solomon viewed God's presence in this temple. So look at verse 27 here. Verse 27. Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built? So it seems like Solomon already understands, God, as we talked about in this whole timeline, God is before and outside of this physical universe, although he chooses to interact with it. But just given the nature of God since before the beginning, how can something that mankind built, how can it literally encapsulate the glory and greatness of God? Well, it seems like Solomon's saying that it can't, and that wasn't the point. Verse 29, he's imploring that your eyes may be open toward this house night and day, toward the place of which you've said, my name will be there. So listen to the prayer which your servant shall pray toward this place. Look at verse 32, please. Verse 32. And this is really, actually, look at verse 30 first. This is really important. Listen to the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel. When they pray toward this place, hear in heaven, your dwelling place, hear and forgive. And so this is sort of a sticking point for a lot of people. They say, well, I thought the temple was the dwelling place of God. Well, it is, but are we talking literally or not? Because here Solomon says that God's dwelling place is in heaven, but he's going to say it a bunch of other times. Look at verse 32. Then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants. Look down at verse 34. Then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel. Verse 36. Then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your servants and your people Israel. Look at verse 39. Verse 39, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and forgive and act and render to each according to all of his ways. Verse 43, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and do according to all for the which the foreigner calls to you. Verse 45, then hear in heaven their prayer and their supplication and maintain their cause. Verse 49, then hear their prayer and their supplication in heaven, your dwelling place, and maintain their cause. Verse 52, that your eyes may be open to the supplication of your servant and the supplication of your people Israel to listen to them wherever they call you. And so it seems like over and over and over again, Solomon, I believe inspired by the Spirit here, is saying, you know, here's this glorious, amazing temple that we've built according to your design, to your blueprint that you gave to David. And just like your presence is here, that does not necessarily mean that you're literally dwelling here, because God's presence, his I don't even know the way to say this, his form, that's not even a good way to say it, but can't be contained, because by definition, he's not bound to the physical universe. It's an amazing thing that we need to understand as well. And we'll see later on that people misunderstood what it meant for this to be a dwelling place, because we're going to read later in some of these prophets where they're saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And they're saying, oh, the temple's still standing, so God's still with us, we're still good. And they sort of say, as long as the temple's up, I mean, we're fine. And then the temple gets torn down, and they're like, whoa, okay, I guess we're not fine. And that's going to be a really big sticking point for them. Okay, any thoughts on that? I just said a whole bunch of stuff in a little amount of time. Any thoughts? Okay. All right. Well, unfortunately, with Solomon, that's sort of, as we get to 1 Kings 10, it concludes with Solomon is at the pinnacle of his wealth. He's at the pinnacle of his wisdom and the pinnacle of his power. But as we get to 1 Kings 11, let's read the first 13 verses here together. Chapter 11, first 13 verses. And really, I encourage you, like, really read through just the amount of riches that were coming in to Solomon, because it's unreal. It was unmatched. Just like God said, no one would be like you all your days. It's absolutely true. But here in chapter 11, let's read the first 13 verses. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. I mean, that's such an important detail, don't you think? I mean, that's not an accident that detail was thrown in there. Let's see, verse 10, had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you've done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all of the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, for which I have chosen. And so we see, I mean, the problem of sin is not absolved in Solomon. Even though he is a descendant of David, he's not the solution to the problem of sin. The problem of sin is just alive and well. He needs redemption just like anybody and everybody else. And if the promises that were given to David in 2 Samuel 7 were only about Solomon, and I'm telling you, some people really do believe that some of those promises are only, well, not some, they believe that all of it was only about Solomon. I mean, he just woefully disappoints, right? If those promises are only about him, man, we messed up, and those promises aren't even true because it just didn't happen. And that's just what we see here. And you would think too, based on what Solomon experienced from all the half sibling problems of David's children, the polygamy and the half siblings and all the problems there, you would think that Solomon would learn, okay, maybe I don't do that, and maybe we don't follow in the same pattern as my dad, but he does. And we're going to see some more issues there as well. And even in Nehemiah 13, so Nehemiah is one of the last books of the Old Testament, historically speaking. And even in Nehemiah 13, talking about separating themselves from foreigners, they're saying, well, didn't even Solomon, I mean, even Solomon was torn away because of these foreign women. So separate yourselves. We're trying to devote ourselves to God. And because of Solomon's sins, the kingdom would be divided. But we just read, for the sake of David, not all of it is going to happen. It's not going to happen to Solomon, but it's going to happen to Solomon's son. Okay, any thoughts on Solomon? It's good stuff. Okay. It's also interesting too. I don't know if anybody else has thought this. How can somebody who is considered to be the wisest man come into something like this? I just wonder about that. But that just shows us that the problem of Genesis 3:6 applies to everyone equally. And it doesn't matter who you are or who your dad is, especially for Solomon. It doesn't matter. Everybody has the problem of sin and needs redemption just like anybody else.
Also, wise by whose standards, and the wisdom of man being the foolishness of God. He was wise for a man, but that's still he's still just a man. There's a limit to how wise a man is ever going to be, and obviously even a very wise man can do very foolish things.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me wonder too, when the Queen of Sheba comes and asks all these questions, what questions was she asking about? You know, have you ever thought about what questions was she asking? We don't really have a record of what those questions were, but was it, well, hey, how does this plant grow? I don't know. Something as simple as that. Yeah, that's a great comment. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
Maybe this may be out of left field, but I thought, you read Ecclesiastes, and Solomon sees the problems that he created with the life that many think he did in his life. So sometimes I wonder if God didn't grant with all wisdom completely, but Solomon picked up wisdom by experience that we don't have to live. We should live. He shares that with us. So I kind of wondered sometimes if there was a measure that God gave, and unfortunately, the way he lived, he had to pick up some wisdom the hard way. I kind of upset with that because Ecclesiastes makes it clear he learned this stuff, but he still lived it. So that's how I've said it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, that's one of my favorite books. And one of the things I love about it is when we think about, we pray to God for things and we ask God for things. Does he just zap us with it immediately? Usually not. I mean, maybe in your life that's happened, but that hasn't happened in my life. Not just, hey, God, give me wisdom. And it seems like there was some, like you said, some measure that God did give to Solomon. But then as we look through Ecclesiastes, this is a man who tried everything, had the means and funds and power for nobody to question him in trying everything. And at the end of it, he says, fear God and keep his commandments. This is all of man.
Man or woman, wise young person would look at the life of Solomon and take wisdom from that without having to experience it. You know what I mean? That's wisdom for us. It's not having to experience all those attempts of pleasure and fulfillment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Any other thoughts about?
I got this idea that came to my head. It's like, it doesn't matter how close you are to God, it's always easier to choose sin than it is to choose God. And you can see that a lot through the Old Testament. Like these people are right there with God, and it's so much easier to get into the sin than it is to follow with God that's right there with you. And I think that's a lesson that's good for us too today. It's like, doesn't matter how devoted we think we are, I mean, sin is gonna come and we're gonna have a choice and, you know, it's much simpler to choose sin because it's the easier way.
Mhm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And it looks so good to us sometimes. I mean, that's the problem of Genesis 3:6. That first sin was it looked good to the eyes, it looked good for food, and it was desirable to make one wise. And the serpent was saying, you'll be like God, you know, you won't die. And it looked good. So it was really easy. And then the consequences are that's not at all what I thought it was going to be like. So yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir.
The demonstration of the um, power and, you know, you can say, in some respect, that he doesn't have just one play that he goes to. He has a full playbook and it sends people in many, many different ways until he finds one that works.
Mhm.
For some people, Solomon, women.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, Solomon had access to all the other things. There's nothing mentioned that ever said that he was an alcoholic. Or, you know, had been bogged down by other things that we think of that can lead you away from God, created like sin, which we do. So it's yeah. Basically, it was what 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 women, all pointing at. Oh, what about my the I don't know how the conversation actually went on, but it was strong enough feel there to please those women that he was willing to disobey the call.
Yeah, absolutely. Brett's point is that that should, just reading about Solomon should really make us have a healthy respect for our adversary and just the many ways that he'll find what tempts us the most. And we were talking about Ecclesiastes just a second ago, and you know Solomon tried everything, but we don't read about, like you mentioned, him being an alcoholic where that was his vice or something else was his vice. But we do read women was his vice, and they made him do other things. And whatever our vice is, it's going to be used against us by our foe. And so that's a really great point to bring out. But then also, we also got to remember who's on our side. But still, we need to have the healthy respect for the foe. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Fred's not particularly fascinated with scripture that's both of the section. Son, which would be one. All of it would be one tribe. Son, which is basically the area where the northern kingdom, Judah thing comes apart, and the lost tribes of Israel, you know, all got dispersed on the Syrian, what they did, they're gone. And still holding up that thread is a pretty precious thing, because it's really an awful lot of.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought that up. I didn't have that in my notes, but that's so important. The idea of the remnant. You know, there's always a remnant, and how God is leaving a remnant because of his promises to David. That's going to be so important, especially as we get into the divided kingdom in just a second. Okay, any last, even whole United Kingdom, any thoughts on the United Kingdom? Because we're moving away from that. Okay, well, let's move on here to the divided kingdom then. And I mean, if I guarantee many in here have actually read the accounts of the divided kingdom. I mean, is that easy to sift through, or I mean, that's pretty difficult to sift through sometimes. There are kings who have the same name, who rule at the same time, but they're from different kingdoms. And sometimes it can be really confusing. And so I spent way too much time on the next slide that I'm going to show you here in just a second to try and organize some of this so that it's easy for us. But instead of doing what we did with the United Kingdom, where we go through each and every king, we're kind of going to summarize the kingdoms and their history, and then really look through the eyes of the writing prophets, the prophets who wrote things down, and see more about them, and then see about what God had in plan for the future, kind of like we have been this whole time. So the divided kingdom, I mean, let's start with the northern kingdom of Israel. By the way, I'll go ahead and do this. I spent a long time on this, and you can't even see it with this. Can't even see it with this projector. So I'm telling you, this was beautiful the way I made it, but it doesn't look like it. There were these nice little scrolls covering everybody's names and all that stuff. You can't see it. That's totally fine. I'll only cry later on today. So here, I hope you can see this okay. The northern kingdom of Israel, I put it on top because it's north, and then the southern kingdom of Judah is down. And this is sort of like our timeline. I didn't put any of the kings on here. None of the kings are on this list. But if you think about the timeline that we had going, this is sort of like if we zoomed in right after the United Kingdom. And so none of the kings are mentioned, but all of the prophets in the order that I think they're in, which some of them are debated like everything in the scriptures, it seems like. But I put them in the order with where the prophets were before they get sent into exile. So Assyria gets sent into exile in 722, and then Judah gets taken into exile by Babylon in 586. But I think this helps me a ton, just looking at this and seeing, okay, Israel stops way, before Judah does. And then after Israel is taken into exile, just look at how many prophets are after that to Judah. It's fascinating stuff to me. And maybe this will help you as we keep referencing these things and as we're looking at various things. Any thoughts or questions on this before we keep going? Because I'm happy to explain things. Mm.
And we think it was forever ago. Abraham Lincoln that. That's about there's time to recover. So even after the split, there were double the history of the United States involved in the history of Judah before they went to Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, you get so wound up in different life mode now that either people would understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially as we talk about what I want to do is kind of summarize the northern kingdom of Israel and then summarize the southern kingdom of Judah. So let's start with Israel because they have the shortest amount of time. With the divided kingdom, just like God told Solomon, the kingdom would be divided and it would happen in the days of his son. There are 10 tribes in the north that are called Israel, and then 2 tribes in the south called Judah. And the northern kingdom of Israel's first king was Jeroboam. And so look at 1 Kings 11, if you will, please. 1 Kings 11, because God gives Jeroboam the opportunity to have a permanent dynasty, and that God would bless him and all things would work out well, just like we've seen all these covenants that God has made with people. He gives one, or at least a potential covenant, to Jeroboam here. And look at 1 Kings 11, verse 38, please. Verse 38. God speaking to Jeroboam in verse 38 says, "Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, then I will be with you and will build an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you." And I mean, that's just a golden opportunity, is it not? I mean, you would think that here's this guy that, all right, that sounds pretty good. I'm going to do that. But Jeroboam doesn't do that. Instead, for a political move, he puts altars and golden calves at Dan and Bethel. And sort of the political thinking behind that is, don't go to Jerusalem to go offer your sacrifices. Stay in Israel. Who cares what God said is essentially what he's saying by this. But don't go down to Judah because then maybe people will defect and stay there. If somebody's so devout, they're going to travel all this way, go to Jerusalem. He's like, okay, maybe I'm going to lose power. Dan, Bethel, we got these golden calves. You can worship there. Look at that. Convenience, no problem. And not only that, he makes his own caste of priests and totally changes things, not from the tribe of Levi there. He changed the date for the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles or Tents that we talked about, I think it was last Sunday, the Feast of Booths. He changed the date for that just because he wanted to. And look at 1 Kings 12 and look at verse 33. First Kings 12, verse 33. There's a phrase here for the reason why, or at least one of the motivations behind why he does this. I think it's so important that we see this. First Kings 12, look at verse 33. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the sons of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense. So we see he devises this in his own heart. This is not something that God has told him he should do. This is not something by, the words of a true prophet of Jehovah. He just, you know what? This is a political move, and he devised it in his own heart. So we see that specifically. And then really, when we're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, it's sort of easy to summarize because all 18 kings after Jeroboam are evil. They all do wickedness. They are all just as neglectful of God's commands as Jeroboam was. And there's a phrase that repeats itself for all but I think 3 kings. I could have that wrong, but I think all but 3 kings, this is said about them. Look at chapter 15 and look at verse 34. Chapter 15, verse 34. I'm pretty sure this phrase is said about all but 3. It might be 4, but I think it's 3. Let's see. Chapter 15, verse 34. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel sin. So for almost all of the kings after him, they're pointing back to Jeroboam and saying, yep, they're just following that pattern. And a lot of times that this phrase shows up, it'll say, he walked in the way of Jeroboam, his father, even if they have no family lines at all. It'll say they walked in the way of Jeroboam, his father, because that's who they were committing their ways to and following after them. And so at the beginning and at the end of the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam sins and setting up these altars, or the golden calves in Dan and Bethel, and all these things that were against God, that proves to be the undoing of the entire kingdom. Look at me at 2 Kings 17, please. 2 Kings 17, looking at the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. And let's look down at verse 21. 2 Kings 17, and look down at verse 21, please. Is this too loud, by the way? Do I need to move this down? Is that okay? Okay. All right. I appreciate the thumbs. That helps me a ton. Okay, so 2 Kings 17, look at verse 21. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. The sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he spoke through all his servants, the prophets. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. And so we just see that the sins that Jeroboam, he had this golden opportunity to have a permanent dynasty by God's power, by God's grace. He threw it away, and everybody followed in the same pattern of sinfulness that he did. It's really just rough. And we also see that not only was it enough that they were not following God's commands and that they were sinful, but in Judah, there's one dynasty with an asterisk on one ruler. There's one dynasty that rules in Judah, the line of David. But in Israel, there were 9 different dynasties, and they would wipe out all of the kids of the previous rulers because they didn't want that family line alive at all. 4 of the kings ruled for only 2 years. One of them ruled for 6 months, one of them ruled for 1 month, and one of them ruled for only a week. So, I mean, this was just political turmoil, killing people, trying to take the throne, and just wickedness all the way around. And as a result of their unfaithfulness, God sent Assyria to wipe them out and take them into exile, take them captive, never to return, just like it says here, until this day in 2 Kings 17. And so that's sort of the northern kingdom of Israel. I mean, in a nutshell there. It's not a great picture. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Northern Kingdom of Israel? Okay. Well, let's do just a quick summary then of the Southern Kingdom of Judah. And again, we're not going to go into a lot of detail like we did with the United Kingdom here. And now I got to scroll here and I cannot scroll. Okay, here we go. All right, so in the Southern Kingdom of Judah, there is one line, but we also see a similar pattern sort of repeats itself even with Judah. Of the 20 kings and one queen of Judah, about 8 of them were good kings. And even if you look at that list, if you look up how many kings of Judah were good, you're going to find different numbers because at different times of their reign, it'll say different things about them. Thankfully, they had some good kings when Israel had none, but maybe only 8. And even in those 8, there were still problems. And so what I want to do just really quickly is mention, at least in all of the lists, I think these 8 are mentioned. There might be another one that's added to it at some other point. But Asa is one that is mentioned as a good king. But near the end of his life, he looked to Syria for help instead of trusting in God. He imprisoned a prophet and died refusing to seek God's aid for his disease. I mean, that's one of the good kings of Judah, okay? Then Jehoshaphat, depending on how you want to say it, he made an alliance with one of the most wicked kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, Ahab. Made an alliance by marrying his daughter, and that was just shellacked as we read through the southern kingdom of Judah. Joash, I mean, his reign started out great, but then he led the nation to idolatry and killed the prophet Zechariah in the temple court. Amaziah, his reign started great, but then after God gave him military victories, he was prideful and he brought idols of Edom back and was threatening prophets of God. These are all kings who are the good kings. I'm just wanting to point this out really quick. Uzziah started great, but then God gave him military victories. He became prideful and he went into the temple himself to offer incense, which was a huge no-no. And so when the priests rebuked him, he was smitten with leprosy by God, and he was a leper until the day he died. And that's one of the good kings of Judah. Jotham, he didn't remove the high places, but I do want to say this. That's the only negative statement that's said about Jotham. So he seems like of the good ones, he's a good one. Hezekiah, man, he was a really, really good king. Hezekiah, he ruled when Assyria drove out Israel. Very good king. He removed the high places, but later in his life, he got sick. God adds 15 years to his life after he humbled himself. But then, do you remember what happened after that? There are some ambassadors from Babylon that come and check on him like, hey, how you doing? You were sick. And it mentions something about him being puffed up. And so he shows them, look at all the beautiful things we've got here in Jerusalem. Look at all this gold on the temple. Look at all these precious things. And God basically said, yeah, all those things you show to them, they're going to come and take them. And that's exactly what happens. But he says it's not going to happen in your lifetime. And Hezekiah's like, all right, I'm fine with that. Which, man, that's a rough attitude to have in and of itself. And then Josiah, he was another very, very good king. Removed the high places, made big reforms in his reign. And the only negative thing that I can remember being mentioned about Josiah is that he ignored God's warning and went and fought with Egypt, and that's where he died. He was killed by Pharaoh Necho. And so I only bring up these things not to say these were the good kings of Israel, but they were terrible people. I'm not saying that at all, not even a little bit. But I am saying the problem of sin is not gone. Even among the kings that the scriptures tell us are good kings, they still need a redemption just like anybody and everybody else needs redemption. They're not perfect. They sin just like everybody else. So, all right, any thoughts on Judah or any of these kings?
That's real similar to the conversation we had about some of the judges.
Mm-hmm.
God raised them up, but they're still men, women.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I love about that, we talked about with the judges, 4 of them are mentioned in Hebrews 11 about their faith. And I don't think we mentioned this, but in Hebrews 11, Samuel and David are both mentioned. And as we looked at Samuel, who raised, it doesn't say worthless sons, but Samuel raised essentially worthless sons. And then David, who we pointed out all the flaws that he had, and yet they're still in Hebrews 11 talking about their faith that they have in God. And so that's so comforting to me, who my list would look a lot worse than these lists if we were taking about my track record. And if I have faith in God, then God covers that. I mean, that's wonderful, isn't it? That is good news. That's the good news of the gospel, and I love that. Okay, any other thoughts on divided kingdom? We're still going to talk about the divided kingdom, but just not the kings per se. Okay. Well, let's start talking about some of these prophets and the way that I want to organize this, because it can be really hard. By the way, this took me a lot longer to prepare and organize than it's going to take to give. And that's one of the frustrating things about, anybody who's a teacher, you know how that is. But when you're talking about organizing the prophets and organizing who and where and all that stuff, the first one I want to talk about here is the prophets that were to Israel or are mentioned in association with Israel. So we're talking about prophets to Israel or associated with Israel during Israel's kingdom while it was still around. And the first one we see isn't on here. The first one is Ahijah. He's not a literary, not a writing prophet, but we see Ahijah mentioned. There's several others that I didn't put up here, but Elijah and Elisha. I mean, when you think about the prophets, usually people think about Elijah and you think about Elijah and Elisha. And it's really important as we get to New Testament times like Transfiguration. I mean, Elijah's there. We talk about later on when they have the law, they have the prophets, let them judge them. We're going to talk about some other connections, but Elijah and Elisha are very, very important. Elijah worked many miracles by the power of God, and Elijah's role was then given to Elisha. And one of the things I want to point out, as we've been doing this whole time, Elijah and Elisha point to Jesus. So later on in Malachi 4 and verse 5, I'm confident that many of us know that Elijah would come before the great and awesome, terrible day of the Lord. And in Matthew 11, verse 14, if you want to look at Matthew 11, verse 14 with me. And I'm getting excited, so if I start talking too fast, somebody give me a whoa or something like that, I will respond. Oh man, no, we're not responding to any woes now. In Matthew 11, in verse 14, Matthew 11, verse 14, I want to look at this specifically because Jesus identifies John for us. We don't have to guess, and those are my favorite. When we don't have to guess or draw any inferences. So in verse 14, he says, if you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come. And when we talk about Malachi, we're going to talk a little bit more about that maybe, but we see specifically that Jesus identifies John the Baptizer is the Elijah that was promised to come. We don't have to guess that. But one of the things that I love and is so cool to me is there's so many similarities between Elijah and Elisha and John the Baptizer and Jesus. And so just a couple of them I want to point out is when Elijah's role is transferred to Elisha, Elisha receives a double portion of the power that Elijah had. And that's in 2 Kings 2 and verses 6 through 12. After both of them crossed the Jordan River, and Elisha sees Elijah taken up into heaven, right? In that flaming whirlwind, you all know that account? Yeah. So this is so cool to me. Where does Jesus meet John the Baptizer? In the Jordan River for him to be baptized. Okay? And so after Jesus is baptized by John, the Spirit descends onto Jesus like a dove. So with Elijah and Elisha, Elisha sees Elijah taken up. But here, John sees the Spirit come down onto Jesus. So cool. Okay, hold on. And Jesus was certainly the greater in power of the two. Would you agree with that? Absolutely, right? In Luke 4, look at Luke 4, please. Luke chapter 4, and let's look at verse 27. Luke 4, look with me at verse 27 there. Really, we're going to look at a couple more verses than just verse 27, but Luke chapter 4, look at verse 24. And this is where Jesus is at Nazareth and people are sort of rejecting him. They're like, oh, this is just this guy. Do the things you did in other places. But look at verse 24. Jesus said, truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown. But I say to you in truth, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. And verse 28 is really important. All the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things. That's so important. So what Jesus is saying is, okay, back in the time of Elijah and Elisha, there were plenty of people who probably needed help in Israel, but they didn't go to those people. They went to Gentiles at that time, people who were not God's chosen people, and helped them. And so Jesus is making a connection here that's saying, you all have got a problem where I'm not going to come to you all, and you all are not going to accept it. It's going to be given to the Gentiles too, and they're filled with rage at this, and they try to kill him in that account there. But Jesus himself compares himself to Elijah and Elisha in the miracles and signs that he was doing. And essentially, overall, the Jews would be rejected and the Gentiles would accept it. That's one of the things that is mentioned there. Elisha raises a Shunammite woman's son from the dead in 2 Kings 4. Jesus raises the widow of Nain's son from the dead, who is also a Gentile. Jesus raises the centurion's servant from the dead, who's a Gentile. Gentile, so important. Elisha fed 100 men with a few barley loaves in 2 Kings chapter 4, and there's some left over. Well, Jesus feeds a crowd of 5,000 plus and then 4,000 plus with a bunch of leftovers. Elisha's servant Gehazi shows greedy disobedience and departs with a curse in 2 Kings 5, and very similar to what Judas does in betraying Jesus because of his greed. Man, there's so many things I want to talk about. When Elisha, oh, this is so good. When Elisha was dead, there was a body that was thrown on into Elisha's tomb. And when it touched Elisha's bones, what happened? Yeah, that dude raised from the dead, touching that dead man's body. And so the tomb of Elisha became a place of resurrection. I mean, come on, right? And then you've got Jesus, where his tomb became a place of resurrection. There's a ton more that I would love to talk about, but are there any thoughts on any of those, this connection between Elijah and Elisha? Okay. Well, we will stop there, and then Lord willing, next week we'll start with Jonah. And actually, I hope to finish all of the prophets to Israel and then start in on Judah. So Jonah, Amos, and Hosea for sure. Thank you.